This is a GCSE Biology presentation on antibiotics and painkillers. In this particular presentation, we're going to look at antibiotics and how they're used to treat bacterial diseases. We're going to look at some of the problems in terms of antibiotic resistance, and we're going to look at the difficulties in developing drugs to kill viruses due to the nature of viruses and their impact on body tissue. To get started, there are 5 main ways in which your body defends itself from pathogens and stops them entering the bloodstream. For each of the 5 examples given, give an explanation as to how it actually works. So pause the presentation now, and when you've got your answers, you can restart the presentation and go through your answers. So in terms of how each of these different methods works, is the skin is a physical barrier, the tears produce enzymes, the cilia and mucus, well, the mucus traps pathogens, and you can mention the fact that the mucus is produced by what are called goblet cells. But when they've trapped the pathogens, the cilia that line the trachea vibrate and they move that mucus with the trapped pathogens up into the esophagus and down into the stomach for digestion. We have nose hairs that again act as a physical barrier, and of course we've already mentioned the stomach containing hydrochloric acid that will destroy any pathogens. So there are 2 types of medication we're going to look at: antibiotics and painkillers. Antibiotics, the classic one is of course penicillin, discovered by Alexander Fleming, and antibiotics are used to treat certain pathogens, specifically bacteria. And what they do is they basically break down the cell wall of the bacteria and make the bacteria vulnerable to digestion. When you have bacteria, they only stay in the bloodstream and they produce toxins, which is why antibiotics can kill, because they can reach the bacteria. Viruses, however, invade the host cells. Because they stay inside and replicate inside a host cell, they are much more difficult to kill off, and they are not affected by antibiotics, which is why if you go to the doctor with a flu or a cold, they will not prescribe you an antibiotic. Painkillers, for example paracetamol and all those other variations, they only treat the symptoms of the disease. They don't treat the actual cause. The antibiotics will kill the bacteria and you will not be sick anymore. The painkillers simply relieve some of the symptoms. They will not kill off whatever is wrong with the body. Just to recap, there are a number of diseases you need to know off by heart. You need to know what those diseases are caused by. Pause the presentation, work out the name of each of the pathogen linked to the relative disease, and when you're ready you can restart the presentation and check your answers. So pause the presentation now. You should know that TMV is tobacco mosaic virus, hence it's a virus. Rose black spot is a fungi. HIV, again V for virus. Malaria is the only one that's called by a protist. We've got measles, which is a virus, and then gonorrhea and salmonella, which are both caused by bacteria. Antibiotic resistance refers to the fact that there are small circles of DNA inside bacteria. When you learn the structure of bacteria and prokaryotic cells, you should be aware of the term plasmid. Now, plasmid is a small circle of DNA found inside a bacteria. And that plasmid contains the DNA that basically produces different chemicals and substances that stop antibiotics from killing that bacteria. So if you have an antibiotic resistant bacteria, it means that that bacteria has a plasmid that produces the chemicals that stops the antibiotic destroying those bacteria. And one of the problems we've got is that the bacteria are becoming more and more resistant as they share plasmids around, so we're having fewer and fewer antibiotics that are able to kill off these infectious bacteria. And there's a number of reasons for that. Antibiotic resistance comes about when you have a large number of bacteria, and most of them are just normal. You do have what is called a resistant strain. You get the antibiotic will kill off all the normal bacteria, all the non-resistant bacteria will die. What that means is there's a lot of stuff left there for the bacteria to make more bacteria, and the only one really that's left is the bacteria that is able to produce a resistant strain. And the more antibiotic you take, the more you have the resistant strain surviving until eventually the antibiotic doesn't work anymore and you need to move on to a new antibiotic. Most antibiotic resistance has come about through the overuse of antibiotics. So we're using them far too often when actually we don't really need to. So when you have people sort of 20s and 30s who've got bacterial infections, they were being given antibiotics very, very quickly in the infection, when in actual fact the body would have been perfectly able to fight off that particular bacterial infection itself and would not have needed the use of antibiotics. Second problem we've got is people taking antibiotics, they feel better and they don't finish the course. As a result, some of the bacteria survive, and the bacteria that survive start to develop resistance. So if you get a prescription for antibiotics, you must take the full 10, 15, 20-day course, whatever it happens to be, even if you start to feel better after half that time. And the last reason is because we use antibiotics so much in farming now. We are basically, if any livestock die from pathogens, that is money lost to farmers. As a consequence, it's often cheaper to supply them with antibiotics to stop them getting sick and stop them getting unwell, and you will end up saving a lot more money. It leads to the problem of antibiotic resistance because the antibiotics were used so often in farming different animals. So what can we do now to reduce antibiotic resistance? Well, as I've already said, only take antibiotics when necessary. There are times when you need antibiotics. There are times when you have particularly vulnerable people who need antibiotics because their body isn't strong enough to fight infections off themselves. You need to make sure that the particular bacteria you're treating are treated with specific antibiotics. Don't use the same antibiotic to treat everything. Make sure you target them. Most bacteria will not survive in areas where we have very high hygiene levels, and that's the best way. If we stop the pathogens getting into the body in the first place, then it makes things much easier to deal with. And what we can also do is make sure that any patient who is infected with an antibiotic resistant strain, they need to be isolated from other patients, because we don't want the antibiotic resistant strain that they've got swapping plasmids with another antibiotic resistant strain from somebody else. So we have to isolate them to stop it spreading, but also to stop it interacting with other bacteria and becoming even more resistant. So statement number one is absolutely true. Most of our original antibiotics and so forth have come from plants. Some of the more recent ones, and I'm talking very latest technology, we're actually digging into soil and looking at bacteria in soil for what antibiotics and stuff we may get from them. Number two, painkillers relieve symptoms is absolutely true. Painkillers work by killing pathogens is totally false. Paracetamol, aspirin, and morphine are all examples of painkillers is true. Aspirin can also lower fever is actually true. Most painkillers block nerve impulses from the painful part to the brain is absolutely true. Penicillin that kills bacteria is produced from mold. The original penicillin is indeed produced from mold. It's absolutely correct. And drugs are now made on a large scale by the pharmaceutical industry is again absolutely true. So just to finish off, learning the triangle, and you have to write down 3 things you knew before the start of the lesson. So 3 things that have been mentioned during this presentation that you're aware of. 2 things you've learned from this presentation, and 1 thing you're still not sure about, 1 thing it didn't quite make sense that you have to go and find an answer to. If you can't think of anything, if it all made sense, that top level can be a target you set yourself so that the next time you look at the presentation or the next time you go over your notes, it is a question that you use to test, well, do I remember this stuff?